Hello, I'm Richard Chambers, President and CEO of the Institute of Internal Auditors, and welcome back to another in my Insights and Advice series. Today, I'm joined by Charlie Wright. Charlie is the Chief Risk Officer of Jack Henry and Associates and brings more than 30 years of experience to his role. He's also the Senior Vice Chairman of the Board of the IIA, and if everything goes according to plan next summer, he'll become the Chairman of the Board of the IIA Global Body. Charlie also, in addition to being a Chief Risk Officer, was formerly the Chief Audit Executive of Devon Energy, and before that, the Chief Audit Executive of American Airlines. And Charlie, that's when we first met, when you were over at American Airlines.
Yeah,
welcome.
That's right. Well, thanks very much. It's good to be here with you today, Richard.
You know, Charlie, a lot of questions and commentary that I see moving around out in the internet and elsewhere these days, comparing and contrasting internal audit and risk management, and the Chief Audit Executive and the Chief Risk Officer. And you have the unique perspective of having been both a Chief Risk Officer, as you are now, and a Chief Audit Executive, as you has in the past. And I thought you might be a really great resource to ask some questions that maybe allow people to better understand the relative roles and responsibilities of the two. So let's let me start by asking you, how do you compare and contrast how each of these two roles looks at risk in a company?
Well, whenever you think about comparing and contrasting, there's actually a lot more similarities than there are differences between the relative roles between each of those two leadership functions. Both are focused on risks across the organization and the entire organization. They're both focused on prioritizing and performing risk assessments. They both should be kind of future focused as opposed to looking what's happened in the past. And they both need to be very focused on value added. So in the CAE role, you're only wanting to look at those risks that are going to add value to management, provide insight to management. And in the CRO role, it's the same thing. You want to be doing risk assessments and focus on those higher priority risks that are going to provide insights and opportunity for the management team to go and remediate those risks. So I think there's a lot more similarities than there are differences. The primary difference is, though, that the CAE reports directly functionally to the board of directors, the chairman of the audit committee in most cases today. And it is a requirement that they are independent and objective. And so in the role as CRO, that's not the case generally. In some cases, some of the CROs are reporting to risk committees of the board, but typically they're not technically independent like the Chief Audit Executive is. And I think that's a really important distinction. The CAE is more focused on reporting to the audit committee and making sure that they've got those risks covered from that perspective. And the CRO is more focused on reporting to the management team. There's some crossover, of course, with the CAE. In my case, it's been kind of interesting because I have the Vice President of Enterprise Risk Management reporting to me, and I also have the Chief Audit Executive reporting to me. So that continues to kind of give me that perspective of both sides of the equation for risk.
No, Charlie, I've heard complaints before from audit committee chairs who said, you know, I get one perspective of risk from the Chief Risk Officer, and I'll get a different perspective on risks from the Chief Audit Executive. And then sometimes the external auditors bring yet a different perspective. And he said, it's maddening for us on the audit committee to know and understand what the risks really are if everyone has got a different perspective. And so he said, I usually send them out of the room and tell them to come back when they've had a conversation with each other. How do you avoid that happening as a Chief Risk Officer or a Chief Audit Executive of the running the risk of getting in front of an audit committee or a board and not being, at least know that you're not going to be aligned? I mean, we're not saying internal audit and Chief Risk Officer always have to agree, but you at least ought to understand where you differ and why, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's very important for the leaders in both of these two roles to collaborate and to collaborate very closely. And whenever I say collaborate, there's a lot of opportunities to do that, but very specifically to go through and make sure you're using the same terminology in the company is an important first step of that. You need a basic foundation so that you're all speaking the same language. And the the words mean the same things, that you're using the same risk rating scales. If you've got a 1 to 5 scale in the audit world, then it should be a 1.5 scale in the risk for the enterprise risk management process or in the risk area. Whenever I first came to my current company, we had multiple risk rating scales in different parts of the organization, a different one for audit, one for ERM, one for enterprise continuity. And we had a variety of risk scales across the organization, and it gave us the opportunity to aggregate, consolidate, and make those all consistent. So if you can find a way to speak the same language, make sure you're talking about risks in the same way, you're then able to allow the various boards, committees, and management teams that you're talking to connect the dots and know that you're talking about similar things because you're using similar language to each other. I think that's the most important thing. Then, of course, you've got the mechanics of you just got to get together and meet and have those discussions and have those deliberations, discuss the different risks and the roles that each of those groups would play in the organization.
What about leveraging some common processes? For example, chief audit executive will go around, do their interviews with senior executives as part of their risk assessment. Chief risk officer ostensibly doing the same thing. What do you think about just saying, hey, let's go talk to them together and hear them out?
Yeah, I think that's an important aspect that could be done as well, is to do joint meetings, joint interviews. You need to be on that same scale as I mentioned anyway, so it just makes sense. And it makes the whole organization function smoother whenever you're not performing redundant and repetitive kinds of meetings. So yeah, consolidate and collaborate.
As a chief risk officer of a big company, I've kind of listened very carefully to any insights and advice you've had over these last few months as we've been navigating through the COVID crisis. I know you were among the first people to really get my attention back in the spring about the potential seriousness of this and how disruptive it could likely be. And from my perspective, by the way, I think a chief risk officer who can see ahead is the most valuable kind. You can't really dwell on the risk you're facing now. You need to be thinking about the ones out there in the future. And along those lines, we're only a few weeks away from 2021, and internal auditors, and I'm sure chief risk officers everywhere, are already trying to get their arms around 2021 and the risks that their organizations face. What would your advice be, and what approach would you be taking right now if you were them? And I'm sure you've been doing this yourself, in trying to figure out what are the risks that maybe lie just beyond the horizon, not even in the Q1 of next year, but in the rest of the year. Any ideas?
Well, yeah, I think that we all have to pay special attention to technology. The way that technology and different technologies are aggregating and coming together in this particular point in time is just astounding to me. If you think through the impacts of artificial intelligence and machine learning and robotics, and you think through things like blockchain and where's it going to be used at, and the aggregation of all those technologies is just profoundly changing the way that organizations are functioning today. And that means that the audit roles have to pivot and adjust to this new technology that's out there. And then along comes COVID-19, and everything just gets accelerated even more. This trend toward changing and updating of technology is just getting even more prevalent in every organization around the globe. So that is the primary place where I would pay attention in organizations, is technology. What's changing? What do we need to be looking for in the future? Second to that, and kind of caused by that, is information security. That's, of course, a highly talked about topic today, but you have to pay attention to information security. The use of ransomware is so prevalent right now, you just can't hardly get away from it. The use of, COVID to give the attackers a medium to get into an organization has been something that we've got to keep our eyes on as well. So I think that technology, as well as the changes driven by COVID, and then of course you've got to keep your eyes on another pandemic outbreak. Just because we're making progress on vaccines today doesn't mean that this particular pandemic is going to go away that quickly. And there could always be mutations. So we've got to keep our eyes on a lot of different balls that are changing right now. I think, and most important though, is that we've got to look for insight and advice for our management teams in the organization. That's what they want, is they need solid recommendations from the audit function, and it needs to be recommendations that are going to provide good insight for their leadership and for their boards.
Great insights yourself there, Charlie. You know, one of the things that I think I've taken away from this year is that one industry's risk is another industry's opportunity. We've seen what the pandemic has done to some of our more traditional industries, hospitality, retail, and others. And then we've also seen the tremendous opportunities that it's provided in the technology industry. So I would think as someone is looking ahead to risks in 2021, they should also be looking at opportunity. Charlie Wright, thank you so much for joining me today. You've been very insightful in terms of what chief risk officers are thinking about, and you bring that great background from having been a chief audit executive. Thank you for all you're doing and for all you do for the IA.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here, Richard. It's been good to talk to you.
Good, thank you.